Well, sometimes a bit of news gets started and it's not true, but everybody repeats it. Not necessarily with bad intentions. You might have heard this past week that astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent a year in space on the space station while his twin brother Mark spent the time on Earth, each doing the same medical tests so they could compare the results. Well, you might have heard that 7% of his DNA has been altered. That's not true. If 7% of his DNA had been altered, he would be a different species. Actually, it's just been kind of elongated, and it hasn't quite snapped back into place. That bit of news was interesting to me because this past week I've been reading the book Endurance by Scott Kelly about his life as an astronaut and about the year he spent in space. On his very first space flight, and this is a man who had been a fighter pilot and a test pilot and had been up in the air a lot. He was busy during the launch doing everything he'd been trained to do, and once they were in orbit, he looked to his side out a small window, and he noticed something astonishing, and he turned to the commander who had been in space before and said, "What's that?" And he was told, "Oh, that's the sunrise. It happens every 90 minutes here." But it was astounding, and it taught him that as busy as he would be, he needed to take time to look. When he spent a year in space, he didn't get tired of looking. He had his favorite view when the space station passed over the Bahamas in full daylight because the colors were so rich. And when another astronaut came up to spend 10 days on the space station and was, because it was so crowded, assigned to sleep in a lab that had no windows, he kept insisting, "Take time, go look, go to the viewing port and see." Sometimes we forget the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in. We are in the Hoosier State, in the United States of America, on a planet that is spinning wildly and circling the sun, which is part of a group of stars that is spinning at speeds we can't imagine, which is part of a galaxy that is part of a greater group of galaxies, and there's this wonderful cosmic dance going, and every night you have a chance to step outside and look at it. And if that's not enough for you, you have the chance to see the snows recede and the planting begin and the crops begin to sprout, to take life, and to grow. And you have harvest, and you have the farm animals around, all the new life kicking up its heels and expressing delight like a psalm. There are wonders going on which we don't see. And these are vital in a world which is trying to get our attention and draw it to degrading things, degrading words, and degrading actions. In this passage, it says some Greeks came because they had come to Jerusalem for the feast, for the festival. In the Gospel of John, we are constantly being reminded what feast it is. These are feasts in which people get together to see each other, to share food, to break bread, just as we plan trips to see relatives for Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter. And each one is connected to seasons, and they're also connected to remembrance of the good things God has done. And so it says that some Greeks were there, but that probably means Greek-speaking Jews who lived all over the Western world, and for them, it was a big deal to finally get to come to the holy city. And they come to some of the disciples and say, Lord, we want to see Jesus. We want to see Jesus. The word for see, whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament, occurs 1,300 times, and it's almost always a command. Look. In the King James Version, it's translated lo or behold, which might be actually more appropriate because we don't take look very seriously. But isn't that what a child says to us at the zoo or at the park when we've forgotten how wonderful this stuff is? And isn't this what we say to each other when we're new somewhere? Look! The first thing God says to humanity is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, where it says, look, I have given you every plant and all the fruits of the tree to be your food. Look, that's life out there. That corn growing, the soybeans that is growing, the new tomato that we're just dreaming about right now. Maybe you've got your seeds. Maybe you've got your little peat pots that you're putting the seeds in. I don't know where you're at yet. Look. We want to see Jesus. And to Jesus, this is a sign. The fact that people are coming from around the world tells him it is time for him to be lifted up on the cross so that the whole world sees him and is saved. So that in his suffering, we are raised up and recognize that God is with us in the worst of times and in the best of times and walks with us. And he thinks to himself, and I don't blame him, I wonder if I really want to do this thing. Because now my heart is troubled. You know how it is. We've always had this task off in the distance, and now it's time. And we know there's probably not a way out of it, and yet we still think, maybe there is. Maybe there'll be a snow day. Maybe there'll be an excuse that I don't take this test. But as he points out, this is why I came. Because the ruler of this world tries to distract us with things that are not important, but which become the subject of breaking news bulletins. And all around us is happening a miracle that we forget to look at. Look! Nicodemus sees Jesus, and he's not sure he gets it about what it means to be born again. The Samaritan woman sees Jesus, and when she hears about this living water, at first she wants it so she won't have to go out every day to fill up her jar of water, and then she gets it. It's something deeper and richer and eternal. Jesus heals a blind man in the Gospel of John, and everybody is blind to what just happened. Instead of seeing a miracle, they're complaining because he didn't get it done on the right day. He did it on the Sabbath. They don't see. Do we see? Do we see that unless a seed is planted and dies, it cannot become rich and fruitful and feed the world? Do we not see that unless we let ambition as the world knows it dies and become a servant to each other, we don't become who we are meant to be, nor do we enter into the rich life that God plans. Maybe it's because we forgot to see Jesus. We think in terms of accomplishing something. I'm as guilty of this as anybody. We have to justify the time and do something. But you don't look at Jesus to accomplish anything, to check one more thing off your to-do list. You don't look at Jesus. You don't see Jesus in order to get brownie points. It is to look and also to be seen. It is a timeless moment which accomplishes nothing and means everything. There's a moment where a voice speaks from heaven. I have glorified that name and will glorify it again, says the voice. And people try to assign it a meaning. It must be thunder. It must be an angel. It must be this or that. But that voice is for us, so we can see that glory is all around us. See and look and know that God is in our midst. I mentioned at the beginning Scott Kelly and the space station. One of the useless activities that I engage in is to look on my little app on my phone and figure out what time the space station is flying overhead here at Napanee. And I go out, and there it is. Brighter than any star. It accomplishes nothing. But you know what? One thing I've learned in reading books about the space station is they're looking down too. At the moment I look up, they're looking down. And they don't tire of it. And at the moment you raise your eyes to Jesus, Jesus is looking down, and he has not tired of it either. Julian of Norwich in 1373 saw Jesus. There was a plague that killed about a third of the people in England. We can't imagine that. We've just had our little flu epidemic, and it's done great damage, but it's nothing to something that kills 1 in 3. She herself was near to death, and at the moment she thought she was dying, she saw Jesus on the cross. And when she recovered, she spent the rest of her life thinking about it and writing about it, writing the first book by a woman in the English language. What she saw in the suffering Jesus was love. Jesus told her that he did this because he loved her and would do it again because his love was so boundless. And that she could see his suffering and she could see him, but she couldn't see sin and she couldn't see condemnation because the love of God was so great. She could see what mattered. All the other things didn't matter. And so she spent the rest of her life telling people that God is looking at us and loving us. I remember back in the 90s when I lived in Elkhart County that I went through a very difficult summer that I call the siege. It was a very dark time for me. I felt like I was being told there's nothing out there, there's nothing that matters, that there is no God, no hereafter. In response to that, I stayed faithful. I continued to do the things I needed to do to serve people, to serve God, to preach the word. And yet it felt all dark and closed in. At the end of the summer, I was driving west on US 20, between Bristol and Elkhart near sunset. The corn was high, it was dry, and getting ready, people, for the harvest. And in that moment, it felt like the siege was lifted, that I could see indeed God is all around me, that God's plan for us is good, and that our destiny is eternal. Suddenly, it was like the test was over, or the siege was over. I could see God again in the creation, and I felt God's presence, like, hey, that was pretty good, you did it. We experience dark times. When that happens, keep your eye on Jesus in the written word, in our brothers and sisters around us, in this beautiful world that we share, and in your own heart, because the gospel is written in your life, in your face, in your body. My faith looks up to God. When you feel distracted and uncertain and unsure, look to Jesus. Behold, lo, and know that Jesus is looking back. Amen.